live streaming on YouTube from the Smart Force Student Summit here at the International Manufacturing Technology Show. My name is Matt Kirkner. I am your host this week and every week for the Tech Ed Podcast, and we are here at IMTS in Chicago, Illinois. More than 15,000 new technologies on offer here at IMTS for the over 1 million people who are visiting McCormick Place, again, in the great state of Illinois, in the city of Chicago. We're going to talk about some of that new technology here in our next episode. My guest is Josh Cramer, and Josh is the Education and Workforce Development Director for America Makes, one of the Manufacturing USA Institutes. We're going to talk quite a bit today about additive manufacturing and 3D printing. And Josh, it's just great to have you on with us today. Thanks for taking the time.
It's tremendous to be here. Excited, have watched everyone that's been on the podcast the last couple days as we hit kind of mid-show here in the Student Summit. So it's exciting to be here and talk about additive.
It's a good way of putting it, mid-show. Here we are, the middle of the day on Wednesday. Hard to believe 2.5 days have already gone by here at IMTS, and we're going to talk about some of the great technologies that you're seeing. I know you're really tuned in, especially on the additive and the 3D side, into some of these technologies that are emerging in the world of manufacturing and across all aspects of our economic spectrum. But before we do that, I want to give you a chance to tell our listeners a little bit about the Manufacturing USA Institutes in general, and specifically about America Makes.
Absolutely, and America Makes is part of the Manufacturing Innovation Institutes. A big family under the Manufacturing USA banner.
16 of them, is that
There's
right?
16 brothers and sisters,
Yeah.
if you want to look at it that way. America Makes was the first back in 2012, set up by the Obama administration
so
and
10
Congress.
years old.
This is our 10th birthday.
Congratulations.
Absolutely, in August we turned 10, so we're super excited of kind of celebrating this idea of public-private partnership. Focus around technology focus areas of bringing not only all of our public entities, but a lot of what you see in the brands you see here at the show. All members, of the institutes and work across all the institutes as well. And so we're really excited to be here. As I mentioned, America Makes being the first back in 2012. All of the Manufacturing Innovation Institutes all focus around different technologies.
Right.
America Makes is additive manufacturing. We're also a Department of Defense supported institute. Okay. Being that we work so much on defense projects and really solving some of those really complicated, whether it's maintenance, sustainment, the tip of the sword with research and development, all those kind of things. But we really are focused around three big things. The first being the maturation, deployment, and adoption of additive across, specifically focused on U.S. competitiveness and manufacturing.
Fantastic.
As we could see here, right?
Yep,
An excellent show. You better put your walking shoes on.
Yeah, for sure,
It's everywhere. Everywhere you turn, there's a different part of the show, and so I think that's a big piece of it. We also engage in what we call the ecosystem. And so when we talk about those partners, those members, that's a big part of that ecosystem.
Okay.
And the last pillar of what we do is our human capital piece. So
All
that's
three.
the portfolio that I lead here. And it's all about, specifically education and workforce development. We have a K to Gray philosophy.
Love that term. Yep. I'm
so
a little closer to gray these days than
we
to
are
K, but
we are
absolutely.
very much working all the way down into elementary schools, all the way through reskill upskill programs. As I mentioned, we execute a number of projects building training programs for the Department of Defense and beyond. But work a lot with small medium manufacturers. We work a lot with the defense contractor and the manufacturing base across the U.S. In those programs, really to ensure that we can be here for every learner where they learn, how they learn. And that's critical for us.
I love that last tagline that you just put on there. Now, Southwest Pennsylvania is home to you. Is that where the
So America Makes is located right in Youngstown, Ohio.
Okay.
I work kind of remote out of the office. I'm usually out in the Youngstown area at least once a week.
Okay.
We have a number of projects out there, but we work across the nation. So we have education programs in just about all 50 states.
Okay.
Across the U.S. We actually have some folks flying in from Hawaii next week for some
Excellent.
training programs out of Pearl Harbor, those kind of things. And so, very much a national innovation institute in our reach, especially in the education and workforce development sector.
So as we think about advancements in technology in additive and 3D printing and so on, I spend a lot of time in manufacturing myself, and what we see, I think current state at least, a lot of applications in things like jigs, fixtures, work holding, end-of-arm tools, but to your point, I mean, you think about the image and the presence of 3D and additive here at IMTS 4 years ago, 6 years ago, and then the things we're seeing today. That technology is really, really advancing in a big, big hurry. So talk a bit about, if you would, Josh, some of those more unique and cutting-edge technologies in emerging applications for 3D.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the places where additive, really has been a great spot, right? I mean, innately, additive is an entrepreneurial approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it in the essence of being able to design and print just about anything you can dream up, right? I mean, that's the whole goal of our space over there is Alice in the Wonderland, right? If she can dream it up, she can build it, and print it and those kind of things. And so I think that innovation side of it, not only in the technology but materials, I think is a space that we see growing, dramatically. I think the application side of it, as you mentioned, some of our kind of more traditional spots, we're starting to see folks push the envelope on that.
Okay.
I think the pandemic helped.
In what way?
Ironically,
yeah.
Because I think it allowed folks to see the true agile nature of distributive manufacturing.
Okay.
Where today you're making one thing.
Right.
Well, when the pandemic hit, we needed folks to shift gears and make different things.
Mm-hmm.
And so in additive, we can do that. We worked with a number of companies across the United States to reskill and upskill folks that were, doing something different the day before and needed to quickly reskill over and really look at a different competency skill set and those types of things. And so, but I think, one of the places that we really see it is also, even on the workforce and education side, is looking at what are the hurdles of adoption. Qualification, certification of additive printed parts are different,
right?
And they're unique. And so we're focused a lot of effort, not only in those processes on the technical side, but how do we upskill our workforce to be here, ready, and capable to adopt that. And we look at that, again, as both a talent stream of folks that come up through that, as well as folks that transition and look at competencies and adjacent competencies across the industry so that we can move into those sectors.
So you do have that focus across K to Gray, as you suggest, and I think we see a lot of things going on in the world of additive in education, and have for quite some time, and the applications continue to grow, and I think probably become more authentic and less about printing a Yoda head and more about what are the applications and so on. But you mentioned the workforce as well, and that's a really important aspect, I think, of the work that you're doing. It's not just about how we get these emerging students that are coming into industry, coming into whatever economic space they're in the future, understanding applications of additive and how to work with additive. But it's also about that existing workforce, right? People that are currently employed. Talk a little bit about some of the efforts around that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the critical nature of it, right? I mean, we know we're up against the skills gap in manufacturing. One of the things that I talk quite often about is not only the skills gap, but the awareness gap in education. And we look at competencies. There's a reskill, upskill opportunity, but we have to validate those things. We have to drive to competency maps that align so that we can look at adjacencies in those competencies. So instead of a very traditional education model being everyone goes to that same training, everyone has a different background. Yep. Everyone came from a different place. And so how do we align that? We're building a couple of tools that will allow the mapping of those competencies and allow us to basically pinpoint training specific to competency versus course title. And it's no different than if someone, in some sector has some additive training, not an expert, but everyone doesn't need the same, generic additive 101. They may need a specific around qualification, certification.
Sure.
Maybe they want to focus on post-processing parts. That's one of the biggest adoptions we've seen over the last couple of years is folks don't have one printer, one expert.
Right.
When the technology was first launched, it was, we have one expert. We have this one printer that does this one thing.
Right.
We're seeing now banks of printers that have multiple capabilities, and so we're seeing the roles change a little bit into having these well-developed teams that include designers, that include engineers, material specialists, that include folks that are technicians running printers, that include maintenance technicians when these machines go down.
Right.
And so all of those things are critical to having a healthy, viable workforce. Additive isn't up against as much as the advanced manufacturing sector, but additive also is an excellent opportunity to on-ramp into manufacturing.
Right.
It's non-intimidating, right? You go upstairs at the show here, even some of the folks down here in the Student Summit, some of this technology is kind of intimidating.
Can be, sure.
You know,
Yep.
I mean, you look at some of those,
The weld
you know,
booth,
yeah, the
CNC
welding
machine,
booth,
right?
the CNC stuff. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, they're larger than the size of a car. You know,
Right.
they're making loud noises, all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. and
Robots
so-
moving cars around here at IMTS.
Absolutely, yeah. There's
one.
one up there lifting a Corvette. I sent a picture to my son last night, who's a car lover,
Awesome.
and those kind of things. And so I think that it's up to us in a big way to align these competencies, drive it from the industry side. Like I said, we're building a couple of tool sets now, you know, to bring access to those and really show what are those on ramps into the industry. How do I gain those? But then also looking at who are the people in the industry? What do
Right.
they do every day?
Mhm.
You know, what are their competencies? What do they like? What are their hobbies? So that not only youth can see themselves in those job roles, but when we look at folks that are, you know, potentially working in retail or,
Okay.
or working in the restaurant industry or
Right.
whatever that may be,
Yep.
you know, how do we on-ramp them into
For
manufacturing?
sure.
The other critical space that you know we really have a dedicated focus is looking at underserved communities, underrepresented groups, including those folks that are even formerly incarcerated exonerees.
Yep.
Right? We want to make sure that they have opportunities to reskill in that same and provide a pathway into the industry. You know, I think is really well-rounded for all of us.
What I like to say is it doesn't matter where you came from. There is a place for you in manufacturing. There's a place for
Absolutely.
you in industry. And you touched on a number of things that I think are really interesting and spot on. You know, one of the things that I really am a huge advocate for when it comes to learning is taking some of those things we learn in lean manufacturing. I spent almost my whole career running manufacturing companies, spent a year or two traveling the country talking about Kaizen, continuous improvement, how do we drive waste out of process. And then we get into education and it's changing, but a lot of times kind of cookie cutters, same message for every learner. And to your point, I think we really have to get to a point in education where we figure out where the knowledge ends and the learning opportunity begins. That's when learning and education becomes lean. We're not spinning our wheels teaching somebody something they already know. We're not starting them too far along in curriculum to where they may be a little bit over their head and then they do become intimidated and then maybe they choose not to pursue a specific pathway. You also made the point about just really a lot of technology changing, a lot of advancing technology in the world of additive, and whether that's all these incredible materials we're now able to print that we never were before. Every single time I come to a show like this, it's like, oh my goodness, you're printing in Inconel, you're printing in tool steel. I mean, things that we were never doing before. And then combining some of these technologies. Our very first guest here at IMTS was a representative of LaVille Technology, and they've got a unit that they're selling into education that is a combination 3D printer and a CNC machining center. So you you do the post processing. So you print the part, and you really get the best of both worlds, right? You get the best of the 3D printing capabilities and the best of the CNC capabilities all in one machine. So just fascinating to live in the world that you live in and watch all this advancing technology. So let's go a little bit deeper on that particular topic as we think about where additive is going. We talked about where it's been and where it is. You look 5-10 years into the future, Josh, at where additive is going to be, let's say in the year 2030, the year 2035. What do you see on the horizon?
You know, I think that's one of the really great parts of additive, right? I mean, you know, my history, you know, going back, I spent 10 years as an educator. What feels like
At
a
what
life,
level, if I can ask?
K to 12.
Okay, great.
You know, middle school, high school.
Yeah.
Specifically, and it almost feels like it was, you know, a lifetime ago. And back in 2002, 2003, you know, we had some of the first, you know, industrial 3D printers in our program way back then.
Okay.
You know, it's hard to believe that now it's like so common, right?
Yeah, 20 years later, right?
You know, and where we really focused is to bring a lot of rigor and validation in those programs,
Sure.
right? But I think when we look at that, and I used to tell students all the time, one of the really great things about specifically additive is it's undefined.
Yep.
You know, we haven't seen the end yet. We haven't gotten to the end of the technology or the capability. And so, you know, one of the things that we really try to cultivate, and we just launched a great program called Additive Edge, is the entrepreneurial spirit of additive.
Okay.
You know, and really the community of practice, because that's where the envelope starts to really get pushed, is solving those problems,
Sure.
right? We know many in our industry are, you know, the betterment of society, solving problems that are bigger than you. That's one of the things that I think resonates with youth, especially Gen Z, Gen Alpha.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
You know, and those kind of things. So I think the applications and where we see adoption is going to be critical. You know, whether we're looking at, you know, space or hypersonics or automotive, you know, we're going to look at some of those industries where, you know, additive necessarily wasn't, you know, the first mindset. that I think, and it's one of the ways and reasons that we focus on all facets of the workforce, because we know, and if you look back on manufacturing and you think about the fact that, years ago, when we had the transition from paper drafting to CAD, right? Some of that, maybe you had some early adopters out in industry.
Right.
A large part of that was, the new workforce coming through and saying, why are we so drafting with pencil and paper?
Right,
We should do this on a computer.
Yep.
And the same thing is true, I think, with additive. We want to push the envelope a little bit to have that new generation come up and kind of push a little bit and say, we can print this. Or why don't we use additive to prototype this? Or why don't, we can use this in a different material that actually is lighter, or stronger, or whatever that may be. And so I think that when we look across all of that, I think the application of that, I think the material side of it will continue to evolve. The access that we're going to see, and we're seeing the access. And again, it's not that we didn't have polymer printers in schools. I think, we do. In a large sense, we're trying to close the gap on the folks that don't, and we can still access that, but adding rigor and validation to those things. And the more folks that we get with an awareness of what we can do with additive and what we can't, as well as where we should and shouldn't, I think is really key, for that in the adoption and deployment of that. So I think, as we look to the next 20 years, this technology is something. It's hard to believe when you look at mobile devices. Cell phones are a great example, right? You rewind the clock 10 years. Look at the difference between a cell phone now and a cell phone, and then. And I think additive is one of those things where, wow, we could talk 5 years. When we start talking 20,
who knows, right?
We have a great sister institute, that's on the bio side of printing, and really pushing the envelope.
Okay.
And we
Which
have
one is that?
That's BioFab.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, when we look across there, and I think, candidly, this is where you get into some, enabling technologies of additive too. When we start looking at cyber and digital manufacturing and smart manufacturing, Industry 4.0, all these, buzzwords we hear all the time.
Right.
Buzzword bingo, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But I think that these are all enablers that we need, and it really starts to talk about, why this is a community of practice, because you need all of those things. Right, when you walk the floor here, even in the Student Summit, all of these machines are talking to one another, right? They're all on a network somewhere, and we're going to need a workforce that understands that, which is critical as well.
Yeah, you think about a 3D printer and what the career opportunities are, and people probably go directly to like design for additive or maybe an operator or some type of a maintenance role, but you've got all of this wide range and an entire ecosystem of career opportunities that students can choose as they figure out what comes next, which I think is one of the really exciting things about the whole additive market is all the opportunities that it's presenting. If you were at IMTS, I'm going to say 2012ish, 2014, and you were talking to CNC and machining companies, machine tool builders, and you brought up 3D, and I was in manufacturing back in those days. They were all, you get kind of like, I can't do this, I can't do that, it's never going to replace machining. And so it was a little bit of that, it was a little bit of like intimidation and a little bit like looking over their shoulder like, oh my goodness, but what if it does? And now here we are in this world where it's really just become part of the overall, I hate the term ecosystem, and I know we're not supposed to use it anymore, but it's become part of that whole manufacturing community, if you will. It's been accepted. A whole pavilion here at IMTS dedicated to additive. I was walking around there yesterday, spending some time with folks like Mark Forge and Exact Metal, and obviously lots of companies doing really, really interesting
all
things.
All great members. Yeah.
What's that?
All great members.
They're all, absolutely. Right. Yeah, great partners of yours, I'm sure. And so as we start to think about how we educate that next generation of the workforce, and it really isn't just how do I turn on a 3D printer, how do I download an STL file, what material, there's a lot more that goes into it, right? You've mentioned a couple times already rigor and validation and the importance of really being intentional about what it is that we're teaching. So let's say that I'm an educator, and let's say I'm teaching additive manufacturing. What are some of those, at really every level, whether it's K-12, higher education, what are those engineering competencies that schools need to embed in their curriculum as it relates to additive?
Yeah, and that's a place we spend a lot of time, mostly recent, really looking at what we call the body of knowledge, right? And so part of our mission is to ensure that we're always aligned with industry and the Department of Defense. So those are the folks that we're going back to and we're saying, what are the KSAs? What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed, right? And then looking and ensuring that these are hands-on programs, right? Don't just tell me you know how to do it, show me. I think it's critical, right? We want these folks to be valuable, maybe not week 1, but week 2,
Mm-hmm.
and they're hands-on, and something that you mentioned, which I think is critical as well, is understanding there are lots of roles in the industry, right? You're not just an engineer or a technician.
Mm-hmm.
You're not just running a printer or you're a material scientist.
Right.
There are all kinds of different roles, and depending on what they're printing and who they're printing it for, can vary on those roles. So there's some very unique niches that exist across the industry specifically, and so we've embarked on a lot of these competencies. I think one of the biggest things, there is a crosswalk to just straight up workplace competencies.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those biggest critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork, collaboration. We know everybody needs those,
Right.
even stronger and additive.
Yep.
Because again, we're not thinking in tool paths. It's not a predetermined thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can dream it, you can print it.
Yep.
It's the could you, should you,
Right. Yeah.
kind
Make a
of
business case for
conversation.
it. Yep.
But a strong drive around design for additive, is something that's been hot for a while. I think it will continue to be.
Sure.
And I think that's some of the rigor that we bring in is when we're talking to the whole additive process, specifically. And when we look through that, so you look at design for additive as a big one. I mentioned qualification, certification.
Mm-hmm.
I think is a big, because that's a big hurdle.
Who's leading in that in 3D?
Oh, we see all kinds of opportunity there. I mean, most manufacturers realize that most of that kind of stopgate process of that's going to hold us up, because if we can't qualify a part or certify a part,
Right.
Especially when we look at the defense ecosystem, side of it, across, all of the military branches, the qualification of those parts are critical. They're not printing a prototype. If we want this to be a true industrial part that gets bolted onto a fighter jet, it's got to be certified.
Right.
And so those things. And so, we're starting to see a big focus on that, and not only the technology side of it in scanners, and if you've been around additive, you know that they're using some medical technologies to scan these parts, right? They use the CT scanner to see where the stretch cracks and all that stuff. But we need a workforce that understands that. That's not a, but again, where we can get creative with competency adjacencies is we can look at the the medical industry and say, okay, well, if you were an X-ray technician, how do we now train you to look at parts instead of people?
Right.
And those kind of things. And so there's really great opportunities to look at some of those things, and that's really the blend that America makes when we look at our technical portfolio. So we align what we call our educational workforce development roadmap with our technical roadmap.
Got it.
So as new development of technology, materials, processes is kind of developed, we're right there with them. So if it's a new process around certification of a part, we have that's a very active conversation, not only in our members but as well as our DoD partners. We're right behind them, developing the education behind that.
Sure.
And we really focus on not only the deep dive training, but ensuring that we have pathways to that training that exist across a number of partners, even you see here in the show as well, because we're not a training provider, but we want to bring more people to the church, so to speak. And so, we embark on micro-learning. So we're even doing some micro-learning stuff, out there. And these are 10-minute bite-sized chunks, not only for reskill, upskill, but
how
for
people learn these
youth
days.
and adults.
Yeah.
But, it's a big difference of saying, hey, spend some time with us while you eat your sandwich for lunch versus, go away for a week, and what that entails and those kind of things. And it also allows, learning to be active and hands-on and all those kind of things just the same. And so I think that, one of these key pieces of competencies is really, and for our separating veterans, I think that's critical, right? Because a lot of the DoD language doesn't translate over to the industry language.
No, for sure.
And so making sure that we can look at those competencies to align that and understand how do they fit and where do they fit in the workforce, is really key. But, and we've done some national research around these programs and looking at competencies and looking at job roles. Has been a big focus. We continue to do workshopping and pull that together so that it's the voice of industry. It's the voice of defense that's standing up saying, this is what we need.
Where do people find the roadmap? You've mentioned that a couple times.
It's right on the America Makes website.
Okay.
We show that as what we call a matrix, right? So these are the things that exist, in kind of those horizontals across the page. And then
what are some examples?
We cross-cut the segments of where they exist. So we also, the best way to explain that is looking at our roadmap is really a heat map of where we're at health-wise in the industry.
Okay.
Where are the gaps? Where are we oversaturated? Where are we undersaturated? Where do we really need to focus? And
so help me kind of visualize that a little bit.
Yeah.
What is that roadmap
so,
telling you?
you would see everything, one of the technical swim lanes that kind of is a horizontal across the page would be, and we call these critical talent elements. Instructor-led training, is one of those. And so we want to look at, is that something that's happening in a high school as a formal curricula? If it's obviously an industry and it's workforce training, it's going to look different.
Sure.
And so we categorize what's out there. Our educational workforce development advisory group looks at those as well. At America Makes, we've executed 125 assets. So the way I always kind of use that language is think of it as a library with books on shelves.
Okay.
We have 125 books on the shelf.
Got it. But it's all virtual?
It's all, yeah. And the goal is to have that roadmap that kind of shows us where these books are, and then we're working on a project that's funded out of the Office of Secretary of Defense that will build a technology portal that will allow folks to log in and say, hey, here's what I'm doing now. Here's where I want to be in the industry. And it shows the competencies and then aligns that with training assets or education assets that can help them gain proficiency there.
Who's the user of that? Is that a learner? Is it an industrial employer? Who
we see
benefits?
both.
Okay.
Candidly, I think we're going to see both. I think in additive, it's one of those things where you will see a lot of self-drive because printing is accessible, right? The printers we're using in our booth are $300.
Exactly.
They're not expensive, right?
Yeah.
Anyone owns one. We have 2 kiddos at home, and my kids have been printing now for probably 5 or 6 years. They're right now 12 and 13 right now.
There you go. So
they've been doing this
old,
for a while. And so when you look at the accessibility that exists for those types of things, sometimes you will have those self-paced learners. And so that's, one of the comments I made earlier was every learner, how they learn, where they learn.
Yep.
It's one of the reasons that we have asynchronous and synchronous programs that are self-paced. They're blended. We also know that in the manufacturing industry, you might have a mom, at soccer practice.
Right.
You have a dad, a dance class, whatever that may be.
Yeah, tune in right there.
And hey, you have 2.5 hours.
Yep.
Why not join us and do some learning at that point in time?
Fascinating.
And go through.
Do you do that? Has you got younger kids?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have all of those are real life examples, coming from me. But yeah, my kids are in ballet and my son races and all that kind of stuff. And
sure.
We have 3D printed parts on his cars and all those kind of things. And that nature of it, that entrepreneurial spirit. Just solving and critical thinking is just something that's so critical.
I learned a ton at gymnastics meets and at bike races, and it wasn't just about bike racing and gymnastics, right?
That's
right. In that 2.5 hours between your daughters, when your daughter's competing in the gymnastics meet, it's a great opportunity to jump on and learn a little bit about something. I know you're showcasing a lot of interesting technologies and a lot of interesting advancements with America Makes this week here at IMTS. Josh, I want to give you an opportunity just to talk a little bit. If somebody wanders by, what are they going to see? What are you talking about?
Yeah, and there's 2 spaces, right? I affectionately call them, we're at the kids' table down here.
Okay, yeah. Nice.
So
that'll be my table.
At the kids' table, we've launched something that's slightly off-brand, from the traditional America Makes brand, and it's really a focus around Gen Z and Gen Alpha.
Okay.
Which really is to inspire.
So now Gen Alpha comes after Gen Z.
That's
for
right.
those that
Gen Z's graduating. Think of students
people.
exiting high school is that Gen Z, and Gen Alpha is the folks that are in K-12 now.
Got it.
So we have millennials out in front of them.
Right.
But they learn differently.
Mm-hmm.
They engage differently, and that's all great. And I think that really contributes to dynamic working environments and those kind of things.
How is it different, by the way?
I think there's less of a clock in, clock out mentality.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at, I'll say, I'll make the spread a little bigger. If we look at my dad's generation, right?
Yep.
And I'm on the bridge of a millennial and a Gen X. Yep. I'm an 82, so I'm right at the cusp. Some ways I'm a millennial, some ways I'm a Gen X.
Right.
But that being said, that generation, woke up, went to, sat at the same seat, read the paper, ate the same breakfast, went to work for 8 hours, came home, sat down, ate dinner, read the paper, maybe cut the grass, washed the car.
Right.
And they did the same thing 5 days in a row. Then they did it again on the next week.
Yep.
Generations today, they're looking for flexible environments. And so, they're not, it's instead of living to work, they're working to live.
Interesting.
So they're working to fund the things that they want to do. And so, there is a big difference in what we always really explain, especially to youth and students, is self-wealth, right? Self-wealth is different for everyone. Some people that is a salary. For very many, it's not anymore. It's things like work-life balance. It's things like geographic locations. It's things like, are you aligned in their mission? You know, and we're building what we're calling the Guide to 21st Century Talent here very soon, and we worked with 30 manufacturers, small mediums, to actually build that program.
Okay.
And it's one of the things on strong culture specifically is all built around the fact of, you know, having that greater sense of purpose. One of the key things I would challenge every manufacturer here to think about, you know, and obviously they're buying machines and equipment, but, you know, promote what that one part you build gets bolted onto something else, and it gets bolted onto something else, and that criticality of that part on that bigger device, you know, is where a lot of these folks are looking. So they want to know, like, you know, what's your social responsibility? You know, how is this really solving something that the world needs? And I think that's one of those kind of differences that we're seeing today. So, like, down here at the kids' table, so to speak, you know, we have Alice, the engineer in Wonderland. So if you know the story Alice in Wonderland, you know, Alice dreams up her Wonderland. We want students to realize that Alice is an engineer. She can print her, you know, she can print her dreams. And so, you know, that is a big focus. And it's, you know, we're launching that here. We're excited. That's a brand new tool for us that will be kind of on the road show and go across the U.S. and be at STEM fairs and those kind of things.
Got it.
We're also looking to take this to Main Street USA. So take it to a mall.
Sure.
You know, take it to a, you know, a city sidewalk, and those kind of things to really build that awareness, because we also know that though sometimes students have seen the technology and maybe even use it in their classrooms, sometimes, you know, the parents are the ones signing the schedules when they go into high school, or, you know, helping on college decisions and those kind of things. And so we want to make sure we're educating mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, aunt, and uncle on the opportunity in the industry as well, because that's a critical one.
For sure. Yeah, no question at all. You touched on, again, a number of different items there. We, you know, talk about this idea of that next generation of employees, next generation of team members looking for more than just what's my paycheck, what are my benefits, and what are my hours. And we see in all the businesses that we're involved with, Tech Ed Podcast being one of them and several others that we own and invest in, all mission driven. It starts with the mission. Why do we exist? What, you know, where are we going? What are those attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are necessary to get us here? Doesn't mean that, you know, every business has a culture, every person has a personality, and they're not right or wrong, good or bad. They're just can be different, and where do you find that match? And it sounds like you're talking about and seeing exactly the same thing in this next generation of talent. At the Tech Ed Podcast, we're all about securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent, and everything we do kind of focuses around that. And then everything comes after. I'm a big fan, by the way, of work-life integration, so it's no longer a lifetime or a world where I go to work for 8 hours and then when I'm done I'm off doing something else. It's like I'm fine taking a phone call at 10 o'clock at night if it's important. I'm also fine like going out and paddling on my paddleboard at 1 in the afternoon if the weather's nice and the lake is calm and whatever. That's just kind of the way it works. So a really, really exciting time to be working in the world of manufacturing, and specifically for you, working in the world of additive. I want to give you an opportunity as you've wandered around and walked around this huge show, and you already mentioned the fact that I could spend a week here and not see everything for sure.
Certainly.
What's the most fascinating thing, Josh, you've seen since you've been here?
I think some of the most fascinating things, I think, and again, I'm a people guy, right? The work we do is the human side,
right?
So I'll kind of focus on that a little bit, and I think I overheard some students this morning that came down, and you know, literally one of the quotes of the week, I think for me already was really, you know, the student said, "This is so nice." He's like, "I feel so important."
That's great.
You know,
yeah.
and so I think it just resonates to, we always have to remember not every kid has that opportunity.
Right.
Not every person has that opportunity. And I think it's a critical piece for us always to remember that sometimes opportunities are based on zip code. You know, talent might be widespread, but let's make sure that we're reaching every learner.
I'm 100% in agreement.
And I think, you know, we had the opportunity, and like I said, so we're down here in the Student Summit. We do have a space upstairs, obviously a lot of members in the Additive Pavilion.
Sure.
So when the Student Summit shuts down, you know, our team actually goes up to the, you know, upstairs in the big show, and we have an opportunity to engage with the space up there and our members and those kind of things, and just having the opportunity for students to see and experience it, right?
Yep.
Many of these students may have an opportunity to see, obviously on social media, YouTube, whatever it may be, some of these things, but to experience it in person we started off talking about, you got a robot that's lifting a C8 Corvette upstairs,
exactly, right?
I mean, there's a big scale there, but when you look at in the student summit, wait, that's the same pendant.
It is.
That
Same
it is
control,
up there, right?
same
It's just a
six-axis
different
robot.
scale.
Yep.
It's just a different scale of
Exactly right.
manufacturing, and I think it opens students' minds to the opportunities that exist. I mean, we've seen that in our booth, and it's really been great here in our experience to literally see the light bulb moment. That's kind of the passion that's fueled me to leave a classroom, and really I've been 14 years in the industry, all working with manufacturers to solve the skills gap crisis. And I've been blessed to have the opportunity, but I've been blessed to be driven because I've seen the light bulb. I've seen the moment where learning's real and relevant, and these kids are like, wow, I get it. I finally, like, oh, this is why math makes sense. This is why, this science principle, finally I get, and I think we in manufacturing really can capture that in a great way.
And if we can make a student feel important, as you suggest, and feel like they matter and feel like there's a future for them, again, regardless of where they came from, it's all about where they're going, and you're doing a really, really important work in that particular space and reaching hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of students and individuals in the process. So you get an opportunity to spend time with a lot of different young people. I know you do, both in your time in teaching and in your time now in the 14 years that you've been involved on the industry side. If you had one piece of advice for a high school sophomore, Josh, as they consider their future, what would that piece of advice be?
Wow. I mean, ask a question. I think it's that simple. I think so many times, just like adults, we're curious but afraid to ask because we don't want to think that's like, well, they might think we're dumb or we don't know,
right?
Or like, oh, maybe that's not for me. But I think one of the things that we again, just coming back to our experience, even just this week, we've had kids as young as 8 years old over there. We've had adults that I don't know their names, but obviously we know that they're seasoned veterans in the industry.
Sure.
Kind of thing, and so you start to realize that learning's something that doesn't stop. Curiosity is something, it's innate. We're born with that, and so it's a key opportunity for us again to capture that. And I think that's one of the biggest things. I would say approach it all with an open mind. Align your values with where you want to be. I think an opportunity for a high schooler today, is just, the world is your oyster, so to speak. That truly, these students have a key opportunity to align their passion in the industry. I always talk about there's room in the pool for everyone.
Right.
It certainly is that situation regardless. And it's one thing that we really focus on additive as well is where we deploy additive. Even when you look in a school environment, right? Sometimes it's in an art classroom. Sometimes it's in math. Sometimes it's in English class. It's not in all of those core technologies like it once used to be.
For sure.
And I think as you have sat here and experienced all the podcasts this week, you see that mix that walks through even the student summit, right?
Absolutely.
But you can see it on the students' faces that sometimes like, wow, and I think just follow that. I think would be is my biggest piece of advice.
Follow that curiosity. He is Josh Cramer, the Education and Workforce Development Director for America Makes. Ask the questions. Begin by asking a question, he says. And we asked Josh plenty of questions today, had some great answers and a wonderful discussion. Thanks for being with us on the Tech Ed Podcast.
It's been a privilege. Thanks so much for having me.